Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to Tokyo College Lecture Live today. Many of you have attended webinars, but we would like to do more in-person event. This is Takeo HOSHI, Director of the Tokyo College. And I will be also a moderator of the panel discussion following today's lecture. And as many of you know by now, Tokyo College was created in 2019 with the purpose of generating new knowledge to contribute to the creation of an inclusive society. And we have a slogan, shaping the future together. And under this slogan, we have been inviting distinguished scholars and intellectuals from all over the world to give us seminar and webinars. And among those distinguished people, we designate a few of them as Ushioda Fellows and try to bring them back every year. And I thank Yoichiro Ushioda. I don't think he's here today, but he's been a very generous supporter of the University of Tokyo in general, and especially the Tokyo College. So Ushioda Fellow is named after his name, so I'd like to thank him. And today's lecture is the first of what we now call Ushioda Lecture Series. So this is the first of this season and the inaugural Ushioda lecture. And we started, as I said, many of these seminars we do, the public seminars, we have been doing webinars since the COVID. And before the COVID, we used to do in-person events. And since the COVID is over, I think, or I hope, so we would like to do more in-person events from now on. Today, we have an ideal person to kick off the Ushioda series. And Bill EMMOTT does not need any introduction, but he's a world-famous intellectual and who has close ties to Japan and the University of Tokyo for a long time. And most importantly for us in Tokyo College, he was the first invited lecturer to Tokyo College when Tokyo College started 7 years ago now, or almost 7 years ago now. Okay, so I'm glad to have Bill EMMOTT as the first speaker of the Ushioda lecture series. And also, more importantly, I hear Bill was one of the strong supporters of the initiative to create Tokyo College. So in that reason too, I really glad to have Bill EMMOTT here to talk in Ushioda lecture series. So today's lecture is titled, I guess the title is not here yet, but this is titled, After the Rupture, Japan and Europe in a Post-American World. So this is a very, now you see the title, both in Japanese and English. And by the way, there's a simultaneous translation into Japanese. So if you want to listen to my talk and Bill's talk in Japanese, you can pick up a receiver and set to channel whatever, which one, channel 1 or channel 2? Or they don't have channel. You can find out. Oh, there, yes, channel 1 is Japanese. So you can set that to channel 1 to listening to this in Japanese. So this title, as you can see, is a very timely. And rupture is a somewhat shocking word, but we will find out more about this from Bill, and I very much look forward to the lecture. And the lecture will be followed immediately by roundtable discussion or panel discussion. So please stick around after the lecture. And joining the panel is Professor Kazuto Suzuki at the Graduate School of Public Policy here at the University of Tokyo. And Kazuto is an expert on international affairs and geopolitics and geoeconomics these days. And I've known him for a while, and he's at least my go-to person whenever I want to get some insights on today's international affairs. So I'm really glad to have him in the panel discussion. For today's panel, we also plan to have our own Professor Naoko Shimazu at Tokyo College, another expert on international affairs, another great expert on international affairs, and many of you know her through the webinars or salon series of Tokyo College. If you don't know what salon series is, you can go to a Tokyo College channel of the YouTube to find out. But today, although we plan to have her as a panel member, unfortunately, she has come down with flu, which has been going around this year, and cannot join us today. So I wish her a speedy recovery, and I miss her today. So now let's go to the first Ushioda lecture, and please welcome Bill EMMOTT to the stage. Okay, thank you. Please.
So I should do it from here?
Yes.
So thank you very, very much, Hoshi Sensei, for that warm introduction, and especially for inviting me to come here today and as the inaugural lecturer of this Ushioda lecture series. And I should thank also Ushioda-san himself, even if he's not here, but next time I go to Singapore, I shall try to look him up and thank him personally, because it's been a great honor to be associated with Tokyo College since its inception, and I'm delighted to see it flourishing and so healthy today. That is not a word, flourishing and healthy, that one can easily use for the relationship today between the United States and either Europe or Japan, which is the topic of my lecture. Because all of us, whether we are scholars, analysts, policymakers, or business people, know that this year we have entered a new world of geopolitics, but also a new economic environment. There are many forces, positive and negative, at play, but the immediate driver of the change is clearly the United States, the closest ally of both Japan and the democracies of Europe for the past 80 years, the most important contributor to our security, and the largest or second largest export market for most of our countries for much of that time. And there is no escaping the magnitude of what has happened. First, what we all thought was a special relationship between our countries and America, one dedicated especially to the rule of law, free trade, technological progress, democracy, and collective security, has suddenly become one of tariffs, apparent deglobalization, frequent hostility, and above all, unpredictability. Second, the country that after 1945 had played the major role in building a series of institutions that set rules, most notably for trade, but also for many other things, rules that enabled the world to achieve a prosperity and sustained period of growth and development that had never before been seen in history. That nation has set about the task of tearing those institutions down. Never in history has the government of a country destroyed or damaged fundamental international institutions and relationships so rapidly, in less than a year, remember, and with such determination. My task today in this lecture is therefore threefold. First, to identify which parts of this behavior by America matter relative to other longer-term trends that are already underway. Second, to offer a perspective on the possible duration of this behavior. as to whether this can be thought of as being like an extreme weather event, a Trump tornado, that will pass after he leaves the scene, or whether it could be seen as representing climate change. And finally, to offer some thoughts as to what, subject to that judgment, Japan and Europe can do in response, and how we might be able to help each other now and in the future. And then, as Hoshi Sensei said, fourth but most important, my task is to discuss those ideas with Suzuki Sensei and Hoshi Sensei, and then with all of you who have been so kind to come here today. In the title of my remarks, as Hoshi Sensei said, I've used a word that is quite severe in English, rupture. And I've then, in the subtitle, borrowed the title of a non-fiction book that was published 17 years ago. The word rupture is intended to convey the fact that a transatlantic and trans-Pacific relationship that was never easy, but which through all our lifetimes we had managed to keep going and get a lot of mutual benefit from, has now been broken, at least partially broken. Trust and faithfulness have both gone, at least for the time being. And yet we are stuck with one another in many senses, economically, politically, militarily, and in other ways besides. America under Trump is coming to look like an ex-partner, a former partner, but a coercive one, and worst of all, one that we cannot live without. That is true of Japan in facing up to the security threats posed by China, North Korea, and Russia, and it is true of Europe in facing up to Russia and its illegal invasion of its neighbor, Ukraine. The subtitle, as I said, is less dramatic. It refers to The Post-American World, which was a book published in 2008 by the Indian journalist, now a naturalized American and CNN presenter, Fareed Zakaria, about how the economic development and rising political power of a wide range of previously poor countries, notably China and India, but also many others, was changing the distribution of power in the world and America's hitherto dominant place within it. That book was a prescient look at the situation 2 decades ago, but it also applies today in a changed and enhanced way. We are, I would argue, in a post-American world, most immediately because of the breakup of our partnerships with the United States, but also because, however important America and President Trump may think they are, geopolitical and geoeconomic circumstances have changed to make America and the president less important than in the past. Moreover, our economic and social environment is also being shaped by technology, a force that in some respects may be stronger than politics, and which is partly American, but not wholly so. The change in circumstances that we see is principally seen in a change in the global balance of power, which has been reflected during recent decades by a pair of seemingly contradictory trends. The wider dispersion of power, as economic development and hence political weight has continued to spread more widely, just as Fareed Zakaria observed, most recently led by Southeast and South Asia rather than China, giving a sense of agency and greater commercial relevance to more countries in what has recently come to be called the Global South. But also, secondly, we have seen the return of a might is right form of great power competition and behavior. This combination means that even as power has become more widely dispersed, forms of aggressive behavior, both militarily and diplomatically, have become concentrated in the 3 great powers. The dispersion of power has shown those 3 superpowers to be dominant in military and especially nuclear force, but much less so on all other dimensions. In fact, all 3 superpowers are troubled in their own ways. Russia by depopulation, endemic corruption, and a commodity-dependent economy, making it in truth a superpower only thanks to its nuclear arsenal. China by a property crash, deflation, and an aging population which have slowed its growth and show little sign of being remedied, probably thanks to the increasing centralization and rigidity of its government under President Xi Jinping. And then America, troubled by the deep political polarization and rising public debt with which we are becoming familiar. Meanwhile, for the first time in more than 3 decades, China's neighbors in the Indo-Pacific are growing more quickly than China is, a trend which, if continued, will narrow the gap between them and China in economic, political, and military power. Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and India are all currently closing that gap by growing at annual rates of 5 to 8%. And these are not small countries from any standpoint. Those 5 countries alone contain approximately 2 billion people. Chasteningly for us Europeans, the 4 Southeast Asian countries I've mentioned contain as many people as does the European Union as a whole, even before Britain was foolish enough to leave the EU. Elsewhere, economic development has been less consistent than in Asia, but nonetheless, countries in Africa and Latin America have, like those in Southeast and South Asia, gained many more options than before. This has been visible most recently in the willingness of countries to ignore in treaties to join American, Chinese, or Sino-Russian camps, and instead to form their own minilaterals, or just to join any club that wants to admit them. This has been especially troubling for the West in the wake of the Ukraine war, as it has cramped efforts to isolate Russia. Non-alignment has become a sign of strength, not, as during the post-colonial Cold War, a response to weakness. But, as I will argue later, this geopolitical and economic trend may also offer us some opportunities if we are smart and nimble enough to take them. Great power aggression and an associated contempt for international law, as laid down by the United Nations Charter of 1945, has been visible mainly in the revival of Russia's imperial ambitions, in Georgia since 2008, in Ukraine since 2014, and now through grey zone incursions against NATO members, putting European security at its greatest risk since 1945. But it has also been seen in China's aggressive efforts to turn the South China and East China Seas into de facto Chinese lakes in violation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And it was seen in those 2 superpowers' decision to make common cause through a strategic partnership formalized just 3 weeks before Russia's attempted full invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. It is also being echoed by some of President Trump's wilder words about wanting the United States to annex Greenland or Canada, and some of his actions, such as sending warships to threaten Venezuela and killing alleged drug smugglers in international waters. We writers have had to dust off our quotes from the Greek historian Thucydides about the Peloponnesian Wars, that in this sort of world, as Thucydides wrote, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Japan and Europe have struggled to come up with a coherent or effective response to either of these trends. From at least February 2022 onwards, though it should no doubt have been sooner, we knew we would have to rebuild our defenses, support Ukraine, shore up our democracies, and stand up globally for our values and interests. Nonetheless, as small or medium-sized countries, and with the European Union condemned by its structure to be a geopolitical weakling, we could at least tell ourselves that we had the world's leading superpower, the United States, on our side, allowing us to respond to such behavior in partnership with like-minded liberal democracies as the collective West. That is no longer the case. Most shockingly, rather than combating the might is right trend in geopolitics, the US has chosen to embrace it, making its own threats against others, and even explicitly condoning Russia's war crimes. And while doing so, it has decided that all our countries are suitable targets for raw power politics, expressed through penal tariffs on imports and extortionate financial demands, rather than being presumptive partners. Politically, moreover, the United States has now embarked upon an effort to bring about deglobalization, to reduce trade and force manufacturers to move production to inside the now high tariff wall surrounding the United States, casting aside the trading system and rules that America itself was instrumental in designing. Yet, at the very same time, many of the huge companies that now cluster around the White House and Donald Trump remain the greatest agents of globalization that the world has ever seen, as the likes of Meta, Alphabet, Apple, Nvidia, Microsoft, Starlink, and others are dedicated to driving economic growth in many countries through investment in artificial intelligence, and in effect, they are dedicated to accelerating the growth of cross-border activity by further reducing the costs of communications and of managing long-distance supply chains and services. The world of 2025 is like a strange tug of war. The politics of protectionism is pulling towards deglobalization, at least for the world's largest economy, and yet the forces of technology, also in some senses being championed by the White House, are pushing hard towards a further deepening of globalization. It is too soon to say what the effect on world trade volumes in goods might be from the closing off of the American market. But we can observe that while in 2024 goods trade still made up just more than half of the world total, the most rapid growth was in services, especially digitally delivered services. A key saying about the information revolution in the 1980s and 1990s was from the Nobel Prize-winning economist Robert Solow, who observed at that time that he could see the computer revolution everywhere except in the productivity statistics. We could update that skeptical comment now to say that we can see deglobalization everywhere except in the trade statistics. That, for as long as it lasts, is good news for all of us, since globalization of business and of ideas and of people is central to what most of us do. We must also, however, recognize our Japanese and European weakness in the face both of Trump's protectionism and of technology-driven globalization. The most obvious frailty lies in security. In the face of the threat from Russia, although this is more true of Europe than it is for Japan, given Japan's impressive efforts to strengthen its defense capabilities in recent years. Most relevant for today's discussion, however, is our mutual economic frailty. We must not be distracted by President Trump's self-evidently false claims of American victimhood at the hands of its rapacious allies and partners in Europe and East Asia. These are self-evidently false because the US economy has been consistently the richest and fastest growing economy of the G7. The truth is that the gap between the American and European economies has been wide ever since the mid-1990s, which is when a long post-war trend of European convergence with US productivity levels came to an end, and when we in Europe began what since then has been a long and slow divergence. The years since the global financial crisis of 2008 have seen that gap widen, not narrow, even though the 2008 crisis had been triggered off by America itself. And as far as Japan is concerned, the gap in productivity and in income per head was narrowing until 1990, when the famous economic bubble burst, and in turn has been widening now ever since. European and Japanese slow growth or stagnation, American resilience and clear technological leadership. That is the story of our times. This year, when Trump has been dealing with Europe over Ukraine, NATO, and trade tariffs, and with Japan over Indo-Pacific security as well as trade, he has not been fooled by his own rhetoric about victimhood. As befits a real estate dealer with the habits of a mafia boss, Trump knows an asymmetry of power when he sees one. In his attitude to Europe and to Japan, he has made it clear that he sees America as strong and us as weak. And in our negotiating responses, we have made it quite clear that we agree with him. I don't want to be entirely a merchant of doom and gloom, but we do need to be realistic about the situation we are in. But to bring my remarks to a more positive conclusion and hopefully to stimulate some positive dialogue, let me return to the tasks I posed for myself at the outset and offer some answers. These were, to remind, to identify which parts of the turbulence matter relative to the longer-term trends already underway, to offer a perspective on the duration of the turbulence as to whether this can be thought of as like an extreme weather event or whether it represents climate change, and finally to offer some thoughts as to what, subject to that judgment, policymakers can do in response. So on the first question, it plainly matters greatly that America, the economy that accounts for a quarter of the world's total, has decided to impose its highest barriers against imports for nearly a century, and even worse, to impose those barriers in a highly capricious and changeable way at the whims of Trump himself, making life harder for business planning. This has not triggered off a trade war with the rest of the world, nor any copycat protectionism by other countries, which counts as good news so far. The news, though, would be even better if other countries, including Europe and Japan, would accelerate the lowering of trade barriers between them. But I accept that while this may well happen, it will take time. Nonetheless, let us focus on another reality. America is important, but it is not the world. Yes, it represents 25% of world output, but even before Tariff Man took power, it represented only 13 to 14% of total world imports, a share that his import taxes are intended to reduce. That makes it the largest single market, one that geography and history will always make important for both Japan and Europe, but there is another 85% plus to nurture. And, as I said earlier, the economies of the global south, especially but not only in Southeast and South Asia, are growing rapidly and increasing their roles in supply chains and as markets in their own right. This is thus a post-American world in the important sense that the world economy does not any longer revolve around the United States, nor does American trade policy set the course for trade policies in other markets. Of course, other geopolitical turbulence could affect our access to those markets. The war in Ukraine has certainly taught us that political risk matters. The other huge political risk that we must remain aware of is the risk of war over Taiwan, which, if it were to happen, would likely mean a US-China war to control the whole Western Pacific. I do not think such a war is imminent, though Trump's own volatility makes the risk of a Chinese miscalculation over Taiwan somewhat higher than it was under his predecessor. And perhaps I should add that China's behavior towards the remarks made in Parliament by Prime Minister Takeo may represent a Chinese effort to push and test the resilience and solidarity of the previous US-Japan alliance on that issue of Taiwan. Meanwhile, for Europe, the biggest single positive boost that could be given to the European economy would arise from a Russian withdrawal from Ukraine or a settlement in Ukraine, as it would reduce security risks, lower energy prices, and set off a big program of reconstruction of that war-torn nation. Japan would benefit from such a program of reconstruction too. Everything is not necessarily, inevitably, and permanently risky and bad. On the second question, the Trump tornado versus climate change, my answer would be the awkward and inconvenient one that it is likely to be a bit of both. Undoubtedly, President Trump's personality is playing a huge part in what is happening. Capricious, narcissistic, shameless, power-intoxicated, authoritarian. There is no reason to expect future presidents of any party to show those same troubling traits, whatever their views. However, let's also be realistic. Only his age of 79 can provide real comfort that Trump is not likely to attempt, and perhaps even succeed, to subvert American democracy sufficiently to remain in power for longer than his constitutional entitlement. He is already deploying the US military on the streets of American cities on the pretext of restoring law and order. He's already urging states to attempt to rig next year's midterm elections, is flouting the law regularly, is seizing control of the Federal Reserve, and is tightening controls over free speech. The fate of US democracy is the biggest reason to worry about Trump and some of the people around him, not tariffs. And there is little we can do to influence what does or doesn't happen inside America. But we shouldn't be complacent about it, nor should we go so far in our flattery and sycophancy to normalize and perhaps even thereby risk enabling a move from an already imperial presidency to one that becomes overtly anti-democratic. It would not be productive now to attempt to predict what might happen in the US during the next 3 years. But, returning to Trump's age, it may be worth considering one hypothesis. This is that statistically, we must consider it to be more than usually possible that, through death or disability, Trump fails to complete his term and is replaced at some point by Vice President J.D. Vance. If this were to happen, then we ought also to imagine that Vance's chance of winning the 2028 election as an incumbent would likely be higher than if he simply runs, as expected, as the former vice president. Again, it would be pointless at this stage to try to predict the outcome of that 2028 election. But I venture this hypothesis to suggest that we should be asking ourselves not merely how we survive President Trump's remaining 3 years, but also what current behaviors and policies might we expect to endure if this were to turn into a much longer period in which a Trump loyalist occupies the White House, especially one of a MAGA mentality. The capriciousness and chaos would probably go, and so would much of the imperial style, although most presidents would try to hold on to as much extra power as they are allowed to. But some elements that are painful to us would surely stay. Unless economic disaster has intervened to discredit them, which is possible, the use of a high tariff wall to bring in $300 billion plus of tax revenue each year, the disregard of the international treaties and obligations that previously governed trade and financial relationships, the rejection of international collaboration on climate change, the dominant position in US politics, society and regulation held by the technology oligarchs, and most important of all, the view that allies are weak and are there to be bullied. If, by contrast, a Democrat were to win the White House in 2028, the power of the technology oligarchs would nonetheless remain an important factor. The temptation, given the bipartisan anti-trade bias in Congress, to maintain some sort of a tariff wall would also be strong, even if it is one that is less high and less capricious. Such an administration might even, though, return to multilateral forums, but including over trade. Probably, there would be some restoration of the traditional American view that allies are an asset to be nurtured rather than liabilities to be bullied. The pendulum would swing part of the way back. But let us be clear. Both Japan and Europe would have to have in their minds that if the Trump or MAGA behavior has happened once, it could happen again. Some of the great continuities of American post-1945 policy will have been destroyed or disrupted forever. Put another way, it will take a number of years, a number of administrations, and a number of Congresses to convince us that continuity has really been restored and that the Trump era can safely be considered an aberration. And what of the third question, on what policymakers can do in response? I've already indicated an important part of the answer to that. Policymakers should not act or think as if America defines the world, since it does not, and they should not act or think as if the trade policy deglobalization of America means that globalization as a whole is going into reverse, since it undoubtedly is not. Globalization, the increased access to markets, finance, people, and technologies from all over the world, is a result of a combination of forces, some contradicting the others. It is not the result of one government's actions or decisions. Technology, as I've said, is pressing globalization strongly forward. So is finance, particularly on the back of that technology. So are the current attitudes of countries representing 85% of world trade. The American turn against globalization is important and regrettable, but it is not on its own decisive. The most important response that follows on from this judgment is that although mitigating the damage from Trump has to be a crucial preoccupation, an equally important preoccupation must be working to strengthen collaboration between governments to preserve and deepen the institutions, laws, and structures that America is rejecting. The CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, is a key instrument for this for Japan, with the UK also as a member, and the European Union is the key instrument for the rest of Europe. The EU is already building trade and investment agreements with other blocs, including Mercosur in Latin America, and needs urgently to do so with the CPTPP and with the African Continental Free Trade Area. These blocs need in particular to work together to maintain the principles of non-discrimination, the so-called most favored nation principle, which America helped build and has now rejected. In September, Singapore and 13 other countries made a good start at this task by establishing the Future of Investment and Trade Partnership, though its acronym of FITP probably needs some improvement. The big improvement to the organization, however, will come when it finds a way to involve larger countries and blocs, including Japan and the European Union. In another big international issue, climate change, countries have become accustomed to trying to make progress without the United States, even though the meeting in Brazil last week showed how difficult that progress nevertheless is. But those efforts can at least carry on. What we haven't become very accustomed to is working together on security and intelligence issues without our close American partners being involved and often, in effect, supervising us. However, quietly, this more independent form of intelligence sharing needs to begin, or at least be deepened where it already exists. Intelligence services do not want to give up the relationships they have nurtured over 8 decades just because of one untrustworthy administration. But what they are going to want to do is to build alternative channels, including between Japan, Britain, and the various EU intelligence services. Collaboration between defense industries has been shown to work by the good start made by the GCAP advanced fighter project between Japan, Italy, and Britain, and we need more such collaborations. In Europe, led by President Emmanuel Macron of France, there has been a lot of talk about trying to achieve so-called strategic autonomy, the ability through our own military intelligence and industrial strengths to operate independently of the United States if we wish to. This, however, is a very long-term goal and will be very costly and time-consuming to achieve. The interim goal of building alternative options and making ourselves less vulnerable and less dependent, even if never fully autonomous, is certainly viable, and it will be made easier and cheaper if we do it together. So, ladies and gentlemen, in that diplomatic, security, and rule-making sense, we are now in a post-American world, even if it remains a world in which America carries a great deal of weight. But after the rupture, as I have termed it, this is not a world which can be led by America, as the old relationships and trust are at best suspended, at worst broken for good. So we have to build new relationships and to rebuild our own strengths in this new, turbulent, post-American world. Thank you for listening, ladies and gentlemen, and I look forward very much to our discussion.
Well, thank you for the great lecture, Bill, or EMMOTT Sensei. And now I have to invite you back to the panel. We are starting the panel. We move on to the panel discussion immediately. So Bill and Kazuto, please take seats on the stage. Okay, so we are moving on to the panel discussion. And let me start by briefly summarizing your talk, even though your talk was very clear. But just to make sure we have understood the main point, just to recap, you asked three main questions, as you said at the beginning of the talk and also at the end of the talk. And those three questions are, the first one is which part of the US actions under President Trump are important or matters, right? And the second question is whether these behaviors will be more like a Trump tornado, you mentioned, extreme weather event, which will pass or have a long-lasting impact like the climate change. And the third question you ask is, what can we do about it? What can Japan and Europe do to respond to these shocks or rupture? Okay. And the short answers that you said, not to repeat what you said, but you mentioned short answers for these three questions are, for the first one, in the post-American world, the impacts of US behaviors alone will be smaller than people often think, or smaller than we often think. And I think that was quite refreshing for me. And I think it's an important point that we need to understand. The US doesn't define the world anymore. And that was a short answer for the first question. The second question, you kind of hedged, but you pointed out fairly, there are both short-term impacts and the long-term impacts, and we need to sort those out. And the third, very important question, what we can do about it. And you clearly mentioned there are several things we can do, that Japan and Europe can do to lessen the negative impacts of the US behavior or the trend towards deglobalization. And here it's important for us to understand America does not define the world anymore. Okay. And you actually listed some concrete things we can do, like expanding CPTPP, expanding or extending the most favored nations or keeping the most favored nations rule, proceed on the climate change issues without the US, which the rest of the world has been doing. And finally, the security issues. We need to advance some collaboration between US and Japan without necessarily including the US. So that's my summary, or what I understood to be your talk. So this is very rough, and Bill, you can correct my misunderstanding during this roundtable discussion. But first, let me turn to Kazuto and give you time to mention or share your thoughts on Bill's talk for about 5 to 10 minutes.
Right. So thank you, HOSHI Sensei, and thank you very much, Bill, for the excellent discussion. And it is my honor to be a sparring partner with you. And I think it is an excellent discussion. And it's always difficult. I know Bill for a while, but it's always difficult to talk to you because there are so much things that I share with you. So it's hard to make comments or questions because I think that most of what he says seems to be very reasonable and very rational. But nevertheless, I think there are certain things that we shall not be contemplated by this. So let me just ask some points that he made in his talk, and probably extend what Bill has discussed. Yes, I do agree that the role of United States might be smaller than before. I mean, the impact that the United States can provide the international system is not as much as it used to. But the question is, I think the so-called G2, the role, I mean, the G2 means the government of two, which means the United States and China working together and try to set and define the international system, and possibly, sharing some parts of the world that as their sphere of influence. And I think this is a very, well, it is not like Spain and Portugal in the 15th century, but I think this is somewhat very worthy of paying attention to. Think that the United States is no longer not only capable of influencing alone, but it can jointly influence the international system by by two countries collaborating each other and pursuing their own interests. One of the problem perhaps is the current economic negotiation, and with regard to the question of Taiwan, the United States may not be well in the context of G2. The United States may not provide enough support for the Taiwan to be protected from the Chinese military or any type of coercion. Then what will be the fate of Taiwan? And then probably the geopolitical balancing between Japan and the rest of the region may change to a large extent. So that will be the one question, what sort of a future that you might see with G2 questions. The second point is about the role of democracy. I think you have mentioned about the possibly the Vice President J.D. Vance maybe following the footsteps of Mr. Trump and then carry on the legacy of the Trumpism. Probably, yes, this imperial presidency may goes against the United States as a champion of democracy, promoter of the idea of the rule of law. So what will be the, and it's not just United States. If you look at in Europe, there are a number of the countries which are now being exposed to the right-wing populism, especially the countries in the Central and Eastern European countries. And even today, Japan is seeing some sort of a emergence of the right-wing populism. So would it be? I mean, what would be the consequences of the lack? Well, the progress of the imperial presidency in the United States may have an impact on the other democracies, and what will be the future of the democracies which may be surrendered to the populist movement, or how much resilient the democracies are. So that's another point that we can discuss further. And probably the third point I'd like to make is the question of security. I think you said, there are questions of, Japan and Europe can work together for the defense industry. For example, Japan, UK, and Italy are working on the fighter jets or sharing the intelligence, and you know, there was something going on, and this is a sort of providing some sort of an alternative to the role of United States as the major provider of the security and intelligence. But probably it might be also just the supplementary, or not exactly fully replacing the role of United States, and I think there are very difficult moment for us to make a decision. For example, the UK has stopped sharing the intelligence in the Caribbean Sea because the United States is, I would say, unlawfully exercising its power against civilian vessels which might carry the smuggled drugs. So in this situation, if we try to rupture from the United States, especially in the field of the security and intelligence, do we seek the might is right and might side? I mean, if we accept the might is right as the norm of the day, then do we need to seek our might by collaborating Japan and Europe together to not to replace, but to a certain extent to complement with the lack of the U.S. commitment? And probably my final point is about trade. I mean, of course, we discuss a lot about the recent changes of the trade issues, but I think, as you said, and it's right, that the United States, if you count the size of the U.S. imports in the global trade, is only 13 to 14%. And the rest of the 85% is still, doing the most favored nation, the free trade WTO rules. The problem is that, the United States has a particular power in the market, as a market. For example, the Japanese, let's say, the high-end semiconductor machines cannot be sold to, let's say, the other countries than the United States. The United States is not only just one of the 14% of the trade. It is a very wealthy 14%, and it is the destination of the high value added, high technology, a very expensive products to United States. In Japan, for example, the British, for example, the Britain exports cars, not many, but export cars, but most of them are, the very luxury cars. Those are the probably, goes to more United States. And of course, there are other customers in the Middle East, everywhere, different places. But the United States is a very particular market that is purchasing the high-tech, high-end, expensive luxury goods. So can we just ignore them? I mean, this 14% is not just the representing the number of 14. I think it is more than that. And I think the United States creates some sort of an indispensability for certain products or certain countries, and especially for countries like Japan or UK. The United States market is indispensable as an export destination. So how would we consider and try to diversify or try to avoid the dependency on such a very unique market? So that would be my comments. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. These are all good questions, and I counted 4 questions, your 4 issues you set up. And one is the first one is a G2 issue, the possibility the post-American world is just a G2 or bipolar type of order, and what would be the implication on that. And the second one is on resilience of democracy, not only in the US, but other countries. And the third one is the form of security collaboration or the direction of security collaboration between Europe and Japan in the might is right world. And the fourth one is a trade issue. The US may not define the world, but they're special, right? And what are the implications? So let's take one by one because these are all important questions. So Bill, what do you think the G2 question, post-American world? Oh, before that, if you find my characterization of your talk something wrong, you can start from there. But otherwise, the first question, post-American world, possibility of G2. And if I may add to this question, I thought you kind of wrote off China a little bit too easily by saying they're experiencing deflation and growth rate is declining and so on. And you seem to be saying that China may become more like Japan in the last 30 years. So if that's the case, we may be able to write off China, but there's a distinct possibility that China or the post-America world, it becomes China-US world. And so what do you think?
Well, first of all, both of you, thank you very much for your comments and very excellent points from Suzuki-sensei. On the US-China question, I mean, in some ways, it does connect together to the trade question as well. And because I think one kind of response, probably a rebuttal to my position would be say, yes, well, you say the US-led deglobalization is not dominating the world because of the 85%, 15% point, but the other big trader in the world is China. And China has been pursuing a kind of contradictory policy of the so-called dual circulation strategy of seeking to reduce China's dependence on the rest of the world, to try to become more self-sufficient, to reduce the share of trade in GDP, but that's contradicted by the current overcapacity of production in many goods, which are leading China to need to be exporting electric vehicles, solar panels, et cetera, on a large scale. Is China a force for deglobalization, or is it a force for discrediting free trade, you might say? So I think that these are connected. And I think that I do think that the G2 world is an ultimate nightmare for the rest of the world. A world that is in which rules and behavior and indeed the fate of countries, particularly Taiwan, are settled in telephone calls between the leaders of those two countries, would be a world that would be genuinely scary. The reason I find it hard to see it as at least a sustained position is that the American debate about China is one in which it has been true to say that the one issue on which the Democrats and the Republicans have substantial, although not complete, agreement is fear of China, criticism of China, treatment of China as a major adversary. So can you really see America in a sustained way slicing up the world with China? Or is confrontation between the US and China the future of the world? Now, I don't know the future, so therefore I can't tell. I do think that there are some dangers that Donald Trump could do deals that are disconcerting. He's trying to force a deal with Russia over Ukraine, which is highly disconcerting. And Russia's strategic partner is China. So we do see some behavior between the US, China, and Russia that is very uncomfortable for all the other countries in the world. but I can't quite yet see it as a long-term probable trend. But if it were to happen, I would be seriously worried about it, because it would be hard for the rest of the world to resist that because of the combined economic power and therefore combined rule-setting power, and clearly their military significance, which then means that there's no longer a balancing strategy in the Western Pacific with countries in Southeast Asia seeking to keep America involved in order to counter China's dominance. America has then, in a way, ceded that part of the world as part of China's sphere of influence. Now, I still tend to see that as being somewhat science fiction-like, the ultimate Monroe Doctrine spheres of influence view. But, you know, one Truth Social post away from from this happening, perhaps one should say. So I think that there are some legitimate concerns about it, but I don't yet really see it happening.
So you're not as pessimistic as expecting the nightmare scenario?
No, I wouldn't like to predict it. I would certainly fear it. Right. Yeah. So it's clearly, I mean, what is the other way that we're to describe this world, particularly under Trump, is that the range of possibilities are much wider than we had previously become accustomed to thinking, which is what makes it crucial to hedge in one's judgments about the future, because the range of possibilities are wider for that period.
Well, I agree. I think this is something that you might need to avoid. But I think this is one of the, coming back to your theme, that we can work together to avoid that. I mean, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that we try to divide the, U.S.-China or China-Russia relationship. But nevertheless, I think it is, we try to bring the United States back to the, the Western, to realize the importance of the, the Western values, democracy, rule of law, and then, the China and Russia are not in the part of these, the partners that shares these values.
I mean, fundamentally, part of the question about this administration is whether values are important, or whether it's national interests alone. Obviously, always, as Henry Kissinger taught us time and time again, it's a mixture of interests and values. But there clearly has been a big shift towards interests and away from values under this administration. And that's, I suppose, what makes it harder to kind of make sense of it. Now, I tend to think that this administration shows signs of accepting what I think is the long-term reality, which is that America, in achieving its national interests, will come back to realizing that allies are an asset in that, and that one of America's assets is the breadth of its alliances, the breadth of its support base. But that's what Trump has thrown aside to a large degree at the moment, which seems illogical from most of our point of view, but nonetheless, it's a reality.
Yeah. I think the Trump administration start understanding its own vulnerabilities. I mean, rare earth is one thing, the shipbuilding is another, and then the Trump is now concluding the memorandum of understanding with Australia, Malaysia, and Japan on the rare earth mineral, or the shipbuilding with Japan and South Korea. So I think it's important for the United States to recognize its own weakness. Yes. And that's where the things are starting to, shift away from this America First policy towards more, we need more alliance in order to, patch those vulnerabilities.
No, exactly. And I think just a final point on this one, because I know we've got 3 more to go through, is that it's a common slogan that people say, oh, countries and companies have to choose which camp they're in, US or China, whereas actually I think the prevailing characteristic of the world is that countries don't have to choose which camp they're in. typically. I mean, they have more options than they used to have, and that countries can be in both camps for the time being, anyway. Obviously, if there was a war over Taiwan, then you'd have people would rather, as Prime Minister Takeo pointed out, too clearly, it would be a moment to choose. That would be, but short of that, you don't have to make that choice.
Good. With that somewhat optimistic note, let's move on to the second gloomy question, the resilience of democracy. It's not only the US, but in Europe and also in Japan too, there seems to be populism and something wrong with the democracy these days.
Well, yes, no, I'm a bit more optimistic about this, but perhaps that optimism will be tested in May when, I think it's May, when Hungary has its elections, and we see whether the current position in the opinion polls, which is that Viktor Orban will be kicked out by Mr. Peter Magyar, comes true or not, or whether he succeeds in fixing or persuading enough. So ultimately, I have a faith in democracy that, although it can take a bad direction for a while, like Brexit, in my view, a democratically taken act of self-harm, it would seem to me, built on populism, it has, to some degree, a self-correcting characteristic. So ultimately, the question about democracy is whether it itself survives. As long as it's self-correcting, we can live with Viktor Orban for a while because he will be replaced sometime. We could live with Donald Trump for a while because he will be replaced at some point. But it's when it becomes permanent and authoritarian that I start to worry. And I'm not a believer in that. I'm a believer that a lot of mistakes can be made. And that's where the populism of right or left come in.
So democracy has resilience in that sense.
I believe so. Right. At least I don't see yet evidence that it is serious, that it, in a systemic way, that it has lost its resilience. There's cases of authoritarian democracies like Turkey, Hungary, clearly until this election. So there are, of course, cases like that. But if you like, one thinks of as mainstream democracies, seem to me to still have resilience, even if the point is that they are still able to make mistakes.
Good. Kazuto, do you want to add?
I do agree. I mean, there are still the hope, and especially the populism is coming out of the democratic system. I mean, we shall not take our eyes off that. I mean, the democratic system creates those, massive power, but we can also correct through the democratic system. The one concern is the role of social media. I mean, the social network is prolonging those, mistakes much longer than it used to. I mean, usually when you have the mistakes, and then, the powers may switch to, and democracy will stand corrected. But the problem is that, these social network, disinformation, misinformation will cover up all those mistakes and, the hardships, and then, creating some sort of a disillusion or some sort of illusion to prolong such mistake for the favor of those who are in power. And probably, that's one that happened clearly in the case of Hungary, or to a certain extent in South Africa or something. I mean, so I'm also not so pessimistic, but I'm less optimistic because of such tools that distort the democratic system.
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate worry, especially the way in which social media, but anyway, the information field generally is leading to an increased suspicion about information of all kinds and doubt about what is true and what is false. The paradox of a world in the developed countries in which more people are well educated than ever before and yet the sense of grasp of truth and falsehood is declining. And that is, I think, a legitimate worry. I still feel I feel optimistic that we still have the ability to correct mistakes. The ultimate test of democracy, though, is whether it can deliver good outcomes that keep on reinforcing it, keep on justifying its own existence. And perhaps that is endangered by the populism that social media produces. Can countries, governments deliver a sense of optimism?
So moving on to the third question on security collaboration between Europe and Japan, for example, but they can be a supplementary to the current system, which involves the U.S. as a major actor, but probably not alternative. And the U.S. is already defined, U.S. and some other major powers are defining a might is right type of environment or the idea, and what would be the security collaboration between Europe and Japan? So that was basically Kazuto's question.
Well, I definitely think that in the medium term, which is 10 years, let's call it, there's no alternative for either the NATO countries or the US-Japan alliance or the US-Korea alliance, no alternative to continuing to collaborate with the United States unless the United States actually started firing weapons at us. You see what I mean? Right. Actively hostile in certain ways, militarily. Then I think that there's no viable alternative to that, but that the strategy that we all need is a longer-term strategy, which is a 20-year strategy, which is to become independently more secure, which I certainly believe in Europe's case that is possible. It's just a very long-term strategy. Europe should be able to deter Russia. Russia's an economy the size of Portugal. It's a troubled country. It just happens to have 5,000 nuclear weapons, unfortunately. Small detail, but nonetheless, the European sophisticated military forces should be capable of defending the security of the continent without a dependency on the United States. But that is clearly not the case now, and it's not going to be the case for at least 10 years. So it's all very well someone like me saying, here's what you need to do for the long term, but in the short term, as Keynes might have said, we might all be dead.
In the long run, right. Kazuto, you want to add something?
Well, I think, if you face the country of the size of economy of Portugal with 5,000 nuclear bombs, may have some way to deter. But we are now facing the size of the, equal to American economy, and with the increasing number of the nuclear weapons, probably up to the 1,500 nuclear weapons right now. So it is probably somewhat different, and Japan alone cannot face such military might as well as the economic might to alone, of course not, but together with South Korea or any other regional allies. But still, we are far short to deter that country. So probably the role of the United States is much, much important in Asia Pacific compared to the European front.
No, I agree with that. I mean, I think that it's much harder to see how that could happen in even a much longer term without the United States. Now, you can come to hypothetical scenarios in which South Korea decides to acquire nuclear weapons, for example, which is not a totally hypothetical possibility. And you can you can see some things developing that could be a response to some of that question about trust and doubt and reliability of the United States, although paradoxically the US may be the country that facilitates that. And then the question would be what's the danger of proliferation, but also how the nuclear balance within the region evolves.
Okay, the fourth question on trade issues, that the U.S. is special issues, you already handled a little bit of that. But let me add one more thing where the U.S. is special, even more than the trade area in terms of finance or currency area. U.S. is really special because the U.S. dollar is the currency of choice for all the world in terms of transactions and also a store of value as well. And what do you think? What will we be seeing in the currency in the post-American world?
Yes, well, I very much agree with that. I think that the role of the dollar, and particularly of U.S. financial markets, is something that's very special about the U.S. It's also, though, an exorbitant privilege of the United States, as is said, that enables the U.S. Federal government to borrow more cheaply than they otherwise might do. I mean, we can debate that, but nonetheless, that's happened. As the U.S. public debt approaches Japanese levels,
eventually, yes.
That the dependence of the U.S. on international lending, which is not the case for Japan in the same way, could lead to a vulnerability so as it were a sense that the U.S.'s disproportionate role in dollar and finance becomes actually a pressure point on U.S. policy to change it would be my question, my expectation. I think if you said to me, make a prediction as to what the dollar's role will be on various measures in 5 years' time, I would suggest that it will not be much lower than it is today, because the inertia and the liquidity and so all of the advantages of the dollar are so strong that it's hard to see that actually being replaced. But there are clearly some vulnerabilities in the U.S. system itself that could erode that, and it'll be a question of economic policy and how that develops. But it's good to see that the idea of the Mar-a-Lago Accord, that was sort of the early part of the debate around the Trump administration, seemed to disappear.
For now.
For now, yes, exactly. Yeah. But and I suspect for that reason that really it was just too big a risk to take for something that was very important. I don't entirely buy the notion that the U.S. is a special market for high-value products. I mean, of course, it is for businesses. I think one has to separate the interests of specific businesses and specific sectors, which clearly are. It's true. The U.S. and China are the two great markets for Ferraris, for Swiss watches, for high-end brandy and sake and so forth. But does that mean that in overall influence on trade, it has a disproportionate effect? I'm not sure that it does, really. So I'm less convinced by that. But I'm not really advocating that we ignore the U.S. It's rather that we should keep it in proportion. Yeah.
Well, with that, we close the first inaugural Ushioda lecture. And please give one more round of applause to Bill and Kazuto.